I can say that I'm genuinely glad that prior to my birth, my country was among many in Africa that had been colonized, and for the fact of my therefore not having had to endure a historical period when the entirety of the people of my country lived what can only be described as an essentially Neolithic lifestyle. It's fair to say that I and all of my compatriots owe our present day lifestyles entirely to the fact of our having been historically colonized by a European imperial power, in our country's case, the British Empire. So, along with what in recent times have been no shortage of admittedly justified condemnations of the darker chapters of colonialism's history, which neither I nor anyone else I know denies were terrible, why not at least also as loudly applaud colonialism's huge positive contribution to Africa's progress by way of, just for starters, having given us the types of housing structures we now live in, and for what were exponential increases in our livestock numbers and traditional food production levels, which would include, by the way, production of all the delicious and healthy foods and beverages we now consume, the majority of which are not native to Africa, but rather originate from far-flung corners of the globe, and which colonialism introduced into our diets to both our culinary and nutritional benefit. It is entirely the colonial era that was responsible for substantially decreasing our then abysmal infant mortality rates, with the same colonial era gifting us the modern medicines we now use to combat the numerous tropical diseases prevalent on our continent, all factors which have led to our present population explosion due to these huge improvements in our health outcomes, and therefore life expectancies, for which no price tag can ever be attached to, but which again are a direct legacy of colonialism. One also has to remember that even the most rudimentary of water pumps, piped water systems, and even the wheel itself hadn't been conceptualized and fabricated anywhere in this part of the world before the coming of outsiders. I personally find it impossible to imagine how we would have by today in 2024 independently built up our country's existing transport and communications infrastructure, or even have conceived of mechanizing the presently small industrialized segments of our economy that today produce a huge percentage of our daily material requirements had it not been for colonialism. So why then shouldn't I and all my compatriots feel an eternal sense of gratitude towards the genuinely well-meaning among the British missionaries, colonial administrators, educators, mentors, etc., whose efforts produced the first literate and eventually trained African professionals of the era, with whom this process of modernization could then be continued after independence and in later generations like mine. And despite it having recently become fashionable to do so in certain circles of Western society, why should us Africans dutifully tag along and laser focus exclusively on the negative aspects of colonialism, such as the types of injustices committed during the era, but which unfortunately so frequently and tragically accompanied each and every single one of history's conquests and colonizations, including black African conquest and enslavement and the selling off as slaves of their fellow black Africans, and that were then a universally accepted practice, more especially since it is uniquely Europe's colonialists who left a legacy of such massive human progress to the citizens of their former colonies, something which absolutely cannot be said of practically 100% of history's other imperialists, such as the Mongols, the Ottomans, the Incas and Aztecs, etc., etc. Have we Africans also forgotten that colonialism's legacy hasn't just put more days into our lives by increasing our life expectancies, but that colonialism's legacy has, in addition, put more life, so to speak, into our days, i.e., increased both the quality and quantity of our lives by way of the massive cultural enrichment colonialism bestowed upon us during the era, as opposed to the poorly defined enrichment we're always hearing about nowadays, as pertains to third world migration to Western countries. The colonialists very, very tangibly culturally enriched our lives by introducing us to, among many other things, the textiles and treated leather we fashion our modern clothes and shoes from, none of which we had previously traditionally worn, and by transforming us from a wholly illiterate society into an almost entirely literate one that uses written records, money, clocks and calendars, etc., with among the various resulting side benefits from literacy being new ways to communicate and socially bond with each other, despite large distances separating us from friends and loved ones. Colonialism also gifted us ways with which to record and preserve our lives' most precious memories, an especially sublime enrichment of our culture, considering that prior to the coming of the colonialists, we hadn't even conceived of creating portraits of our dignitaries, let alone of common folk, but which today we take completely for granted. Colonialism also culturally enriched us with all of our current favorite sports, pastimes, and recreational activities, and as previously mentioned, most of our now staple foods, as well as many fast food snacks and beverages, with colonialism's enrichment of our culture reaching right down to the musical instruments we now use to compose, record, play, and listen on demand to our favorite melodies. It is ironically the colonialists who abolished our heinous local cultural practice of slavery, the British having outlawed their citizens practicing it long before my country's colonization, and which many of us Africans were then either actively practicing or suffering devastatingly from. Apart from the colonialists actively stigmatizing then widely socially acceptable practices such as female genital mutilation, child labor, and even wife beating, etc. It is culturally the colonialist administrative and judicial forms of government that we adopted wholesale, and which we today pompously pronounce that we're governing ourselves by in a quote unquote just and equitable manner. With this, of course, being far from an exhaustive list of the many various forms of cultural enrichment colonialism brought along with it. Most tellingly of all, for all the ill that is spoken and written in many invariably utterly one-sided appraisals of the history of our colonization by Europe's imperial powers, the only behavior we seem to be displaying post-independence in response to colonialism is our people's continued attempts to ever more closely emulate our former colonizers' cultures and lifestyles, to the point where, when these copycat efforts invariably have come up short, many of us Africans, trained professionals and unskilled workers alike, scramble to physically reunite ourselves with our supposedly irredeemably evil white racist former colonizers, very often at great mortal risk to those of us attempting to do so whenever the opportunity presents itself, as the world has very much been witnessing in recent years. Given this yearning and fascination by us Africans for all things Western ever since first contact was made between our two continents, namely Europe and Africa, I think it's therefore not unreasonable to say that, in effect, colonialism was simply the price the generations preceding ours paid for us Africans who are alive today to enjoy what we presently consider to be, and even treasure as, our modern African way of life. Thanks very much for watching. I apologize if this video's quality wasn't possibly the greatest, but I hope you'll forgive me considering that it is the first one I've ever posted online, and which was on what, in my opinion, is a far too infrequently expressed perspective of my country's and continent's history, and one which I felt I badly wanted to share. Please share this video if you largely agree with the views expressed in it. But again, thanks so much for watching.